Hey guys, this is Brandon Flores. My literary review is on high responders versus low responders. So, introduction. Most research data exists on a bell curve, with the majority of people existing somewhere in the middle. Oftentimes, outliers are removed in order to increase data validity. These populations on the end of the spectrum have proven to be special populations categorized as either low responders, so this is people that are more than one standard deviation below the mean for the variable of interest, or high responders, who are people that are more than one standard deviation above the mean for the variable of interest. So originally, it was more of an observation based on research that was not specifically looking for these extremes, but as these extremes started to become more common and more noted, there became a need for evidence that they actually existed, other than kind of accidental anecdotes. Uh, the main interest was really in high responders. Much of exercise performance is based on increasing capacity, especially when it comes to sports and sports performance. Low responders also could potentially change recommendation, training, and exercise protocols, being that they would be the ones that would least likely benefit from current recommendations. So they started to look for testable markers for responsiveness. In 1998, Chapman tested normal responders versus high responders at 2,800 feet of elevation. While both groups did show a general increase in EPO, high responders had a significant increase above the normal group. They also exhibited less decline in performance, specifically VO2 max at elevation, and also returning to normal elevation, they actually showed an increase in performance, at least initially, before returning back to baseline. The normal group showed a decline, getting back to elevation. In 2016, Ogasawara looked into cytokine levels between low and high responders. High responders had elevated levels of cytokines, including natural killer cells. He finished his research theorizing that a stronger immune system could allow athletes for faster recovery, and it could allow them to train harder without the risk of disease that sometimes is associated with high intensity or aggressive training methods. Next is the correlation of response levels amongst characteristics. In 2014, Mann wanted to see if a person who was a high responder in a particular category would also be a high responder in a similar category. However, the results were extremely inconsistent. Some high responders for markers that he looked at, which included strength, protein synthesis, 1 rep max, were also high responders for protein synthesis. So someone who was strong could potentially also have an increased capacity for hypertrophy. However, some responders for strength were actually low responders for markers such as protein synthesis. And overall, the results were too scattered to confirm a true correlation between related traits, but he did say that he would consider similar traits to be generally favorable on both ends of the spectrum, meaning that if someone was a low responder for, say, like protein synthesis, then it'd be generally favorable to assume they're also low responders for strength. So the question became, where does responsiveness come from? In 2014, Mann again found that twins had nearly identical responsiveness to all categories, while responsiveness between immediate family members could only account for about 60%. Uh, Research such as this changed the focus of to DNA and finding the exact markers for high and low responsiveness. In 2011, Davidson came out with a landmark study related to this topic. Instead of looking at the DNA itself, they decided to focus on the messenger RNA. Initially, they identified 21 strains of RNA that directly were found to influence resistance training. After a 12-week resistance training program, Four strains of RNA were found to be different between high and low responders. These strains of RNA were found to be related to hypertrophy, strength, and protein synthesis. In 2011, so the same year, Keller chose to attack it from a different perspective, and he was looking at DNA components. Overall, he found three unique but consistent DNA sequences that influenced over 100 genes that were directly related to exercise parameter responsiveness. So he did find a true DNA component. And the research that came after these, nothing specific that I decided to cite in this presentation, essentially said that Keller's findings influence the RNA that Davidson found. So much research was conducted initially without the high and low responder categories already set. The only intent was to find them. The high and low responders were essentially assessed during the analysis of the data at the end of the experiment. The goal became to find a way to predict responsiveness in order to create more direct and focused research. In 2010, Timmons looked into genetic components of VO2 training potential in order to create markers for responsiveness prediction. He found 29 sequence RNA molecule that was underrepresented in low responders and overrepresented in high responders, and this was able to account for 23% of variance in responsiveness of the general population. And that 23 split up about even for high and low responders. In 2016, Jones looked at physiological markers that could be tested prior to experimentation. His theory was that uh, genetic markers such genetic sorry that was Siri. Genetic markers such as RNA aren't necessarily feasible to test, especially as your sample population gets larger. So what he found was that AMPK and PCG1 were found to be elevated in high responders to some degree, almost regardless of the characteristic that was being studied. These two markers aren't responsible for high responsiveness, though. So essentially, what he's saying is that these two markers are elevated in people who would be high responders, but they themselves don't cause the high responsiveness. That's the genetic component that was previously described. In 2015, Prestes wanted to look at special populations to see if the predictions that were previously showed in the slide before would be valid for people with chronic diseases such as diabetes and CVD. What they found was that the disease actually caused slight genetic modifications, which affected the prediction markers. However, during the research, they also found that changes in hyperglycemia, uh, specifically lowering hyperglycemia, could return some marker RNA levels to research usable levels, so returning it back to the expected healthy population markers. In 2016, Parr researched whether the previously mentioned predictors worked for an obese population, being that obesity is obviously becoming an epidemic in modern society. They found that chronic diseases such as obesity affected genetic and physiological components, specifically the expression of RNA in high and low responders was different than in healthy counterparts. Um, and they also found that levels of the PCG1 were extremely different, enough to where if you were to predict an obese person's high or low responsiveness, it would most likely skew your entire data. And finally, they wanted to look at individualization of exercise prescription for high and low responders. What differences in training should the two different groups have? Does age or sex make a difference with training in regards to responsiveness? And then, are there any issues with being a high responder? As for the most part, the research up to this point has been generally positive as far as being a high responder. So regarding performance, in 2016, Ahitiainen performed two essential studies within the same year. However, the data from the first study kind of led into the second study. So the first study looked at prescribing volume and intensity based on response levels. Uh, what she found was that high responders who were the parameters of the study was that high responders were given low volume and intensity, and low responders were given high volume and intensity. The results were closer than test groups that were prescribed the same velocity and intensity, meaning that low responders who were given high volume and intensity could essentially reach uh, normal or exceed their capacity. The second looked at whether gender made a difference in responsiveness. Really, essentially, it didn't. High and low responders had comparable results regardless of gender. However, during her study, which was not something she was specifically looking for, she did find that age was a major influence, as responsiveness overall decreased with age, meaning that a high responder in their late 60s would generally be closer to the average than a high responder in their early 20s. And as far as recovery goes, in 2010, Machado published that high responders for creatine kinase levels, which are elevated with increased muscle damage, which would be found after intense exercise, should modify exercise with more rest to prevent rhabdomyolysis, which is a disorder where the kidneys are unable to efficiently filter increased muscular waste, and it's usually found after high intensity interval workouts, especially those with excessive volume. And referring back to the 2014 man study, he found that high responders for performance may not necessarily be high responders for recovery, which can lead to overtraining. Nutrition and sleep are also individual factors that should be addressed. For example, someone who is a high responder and is able to function efficiently with, say, 6 hours of sleep, um, is going to be very different than a high responder who needs 8 hours of sleep to recover properly. And then same thing with nutrition. So summarizing the key points in this PowerPoint presentation, high and low responders are important, being that they can represent up to a third of test subjects with a given test variable. Genetic factors are the main mechanism that determines responsiveness, specifically DNA and messenger RNA. Test factors include RNA expression and AMPK and PCG1 levels. These can be used to determine whether someone will be expected to be a high or low responder for a given variable. And then finally, modifications should be made to exercise to best accommodate response levels of individuals to maximize health and performance returns, which at the end of the day is always our goal. Finishing up, there's my references. Alright guys, thanks for watching.